Okay, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for accommodating the presentations for two of our activities. This is Eduardo Casilla-Sanchez with the OSU team, and we had to reschedule this presentation, so it was the chance to have all our students in these two activities present. So thanks for accommodating that. We're going to have two short presentations for two of our activities. The first one is going to be presented by our students, Shashinia Da Silva and Travis Hagan. They're both second-year PhD students working on, and they're co-advised by myself and Jinsub Kim. And then we're going to have the second presentation by our PhD student, Chan Huo, and he's being co-advised by myself and Rakesh. And Chan is graduating in June of this year, so that's going to be his last presentation. So make it very good. Thank you guys. So I'll leave it with Shane and Travis.
Hello, I'm Travis Hagan. So our project is Attack Resilient Data Analytics for Power Grid Operations. So the motivation behind this project, mainly modernizing power grid. So we're integrating more distributed generation and adaptive control systems today. And a big part of that is data. So if we put in bad data, we're going to get bad decisions out. And bad decisions are going to lead to blackouts. So an easy attack point is GPS attacks, because they don't need to actually go there and remove equipment. It's just, you could do it from a mountain or something remotely. So the project description, on the left there we have an example of a power grid. And in this case it's a synthetic power grid. And that's going to stream data to a phaser data collector, or PDC. And then that PDC feeds data into the control room and also to our system, which is in this case, just a server consisting of like a power system solver, some PMU data correction, and some protective algorithms. So the approach in our work here is on the left there, we're going to start with the PMU data, do some PMU data correction, feed that into a Python API, which is going to control our PSSC dynamic simulation, as well as control the protection and control algorithms and creating devices for the PSSC dynamic simulation. And then out of that, we're going to get control actions such as updating relay settings, load shedding, or line generator disconnect. So I want to talk about possible attacks on PMU devices. There's the obvious remove from service. I think that's pretty straightforward. You could hack the PMU to PDC connection, which is still rather difficult but possible. GPS jamming doesn't really affect PMU devices all that much. It just takes them offline. And the actual spoofing is probably about the most harmful at this point. So that's where we decided to focus most of our effort. So GPS spoofing relies on carrying away the 1 pulse per second synchronism from the GPS satellites. And as an example, we found this case in Mexico, which has a hydroelectric generator in Angostura, which feeds two 400 kV lines and a 115 kV line to Chicoasin, and that feeds loads. So the setup is that it was discovered that when a fault happens on a 400 kV line, there's a 7-degree phase shift from end to end. So they have differential relays that look at the line to determine if there is a fault. When both faults happen, there's a 14-degree difference. When faults happen on both 400 kV lines, the generator falls out of sync and causes issues. So to protect the generator, they're using differential relaying to trip it when there's more than a 10-degree difference between the two buses. So this is where the GPS spoofing comes in. So if a spoofer were to be able to actually access one of these, and as the communication thinks that they're in sync, carrying away the clock up to 200 milliseconds would cause a huge phase angle change and thereby trip the generator. So in the case, we found a case where someone had actually tried this, and they were able, within about 4 minutes, to cause a 10-degree difference in the power system. So that's the start of the attack to the end. So it's not all that difficult. And the 200 milliseconds here is actually the phaser data collector limit. So if the PMU is behind by more than 200 milliseconds, and that's including all delays through the entire system, then it's just going to ignore that data altogether. So I'm just want to go back to the our approach here and kind of move on to the actual dynamic simulation. So we are using RTS 1996. One of the primary issues with using this is creating a realistic power grid. To kind of start with that, we just use BPA, or Bonneville Power Administration recommendations, and how they operate their grid. And we're primarily implementing an angle change attack, like we talked about in the spoofing example before. So I'm going to move on to protection and control algorithms and the protected device settings. So I'd alluded to the issues with creating a realistic grid and protected devices. And primarily BPA uses overcurrent relays, frequency voltage, distance, volt certs, load shedding. And one of the things that we don't like is there's no differential relay, which is a huge protection point in most systems. So that third column that says protected devices typical, that's typically what BPA is going to use on their system. However, in PSSE, that fourth column, or protected devices sim, that's how many devices we have in our simulation right now. So total, just for a 104 branch or 73 bus, there's 772 devices. And these all have to be coordinated properly. There's a lot of missing information about branch and branch rates. So we're having to come up with all this and then test it to make sure that our grid accurately models a grid in use. So one of the protection algorithms that we have in place right now is what we call a rollout policy. So it's an automated load shedding policy. So the way this works is you start the simulation and run to when something happens. Once this happens, you're going to generate a list of different actions, like load shedding actions, that you could take. And you're going to test each one of these in the simulation to determine which one would be most beneficial to the power system. You apply that and then reevaluate until hopefully your grid stabilizes and you've lost as little load as possible. That's not always the case, though. So how does this work with real devices? On the bottom left there, we have an example of a PMU. This is a SEL 351. Any more PMUs aren't just PMUs, they're PMUs and relays. So this one, for example, has all the box or little circles on the right there. Those are all different protective devices that are integrated into this unit. So there's a synchronism check, under voltage, overcurrent, over voltage, directional overcurrent, and frequency. So you can do a lot with just one PMU. So if you actually wanted to update this and change protection settings while the grid is operating, they've actually accommodated that by including 6 settings groups. So you could update that remotely from the control center or actually in via USB or serial in a substation. So now I'm going to hand off to Shashini, and she's going to talk about the PMU data and PMU data correction.
Thank you, Travis. In this part of the presentation, I will talk about PMU data correction method that we are proposing in our work. Identifying a low-dimensional subspace based on real-time PMU data collected over the power network in a period of time is kind of an existing research technique to detect events happening in the power system. So initially, we did a small experiment to see how well this low-dimensional subspace, characterized by the dominant eigenvalue vectors of the covariance metric of the measurements collected over time, actually varies over time. So what we did was we collected PMU measurements from OSU campus power grid from like 5 PMUs over 1 week of period of time. Then we segmented this data set into 10-minute interval data segments. And then we generate the subspace based on one data segment and kind of observed how well this low-dimensional subspace, predetermined low-dimensional subspace, matches with, varies with, no, I'm sorry, like kind of matches with the rest of the data segments collected from the network. So as this figure shows, what we observed was that this low-dimensional subspace was pretty time invariant, which means that the normalized approximation error, that is the difference of the data set with the projection of those data set onto the predetermined subspace, was quite small. We were thinking like why or how this almost time invariant low dimensional subspace could exist. If we look at the voltage phasor and current phasor measurements collected from the power network, they are constrained by Kirchhoffs Law. For an example, if we take the small power grid and the subsystem bus 1, bus 2 and bus 3, the voltages collected from bus 1, 2 and 3 together with all the outgoing current measurements in the connecting branches should satisfy Kirchhoff's current and Kirchhoff's voltage laws. What this means is that a legitimate measurement vector coming from this power network should actually come from the solution space of this equation, which is governed by the physical law. So this led us, the approach of correcting corrupted PMU measurements is based on this idea that a legitimate measurement vector should come from the solution space of this equation. This figure here kind of gives the high-level idea of our approach. We use the knowledge of the solution space to detect and mitigate the effect of data attacks. So the authentic original PMU data point collected from the network should lie on the solution space of this system equation. When the malicious data attack occurs, what happens is this authentic PMU data point is moved further away from the solution space. So our objective is to bring this spoofed PMU data point back onto the solution space by using projecting techniques, such that the recovered PMU data point as close as possible to the authentic PMU data point. Let me now move on to the PMU measurement model we are considering in our work. At one bus with a PMU, we collect voltage phasor and outgoing power flow measurements that in the connecting branches for that PMU. We assume that PMUs are sparsely deployed in the network. So why here is the PMU measurement vector? Every entry in the PMU measurement vector corresponds to one measurement collected from the PMUs deployed in the network. State vector corresponds to voltage phasor information of the power grid. And H here is the nonlinear measurement function that relates the state vector to the PMU measurements. To account for measurement noise, we introduce vector E, which is a Gaussian random noise vector. To make sure that our PMU measurement model is realistic enough, we set the standard deviation of the noise in each entry to match with the required accuracy standards for PMUs. For an example, if we take the PMU angle portion, there could be 5%, up to 5% error. So we account that information in the model. And the attacked vector A here, it depends on the type of the attack. Since we are talking about GPS spoofing attack, in this artwork, the attack vector will have non-zero entries in the corresponding locations of the PMU2 vector, where angle portion and the attacked angle portion. Together with PMU measurements, we are also leveraging SCADA measurements collected from the power network. When we use both SCADA and PMU measurements, what happens is that it reduces the solution space of the equations. As the SCADA measurements, we only consider the SCADA measurements coming from a trustworthy set of SCADA meters. So as the trustworthy set, what we mean by a trustworthy set of SCADA meters is that the operator is confident that this set of meters are not corrupted, probably due to high security protocols operating. The measurement model is simple. It has the nonlinear measurement function again, which relates the state vector to the scalar measurement and the Gaussian random noise. In order to correct the corrupted PMU measurements, as I said, we leverage both scalar and PMU measurements collected from the network. Using this combined measurements further reduces the solution space of the PMU data vector. The nonlinear projection the measurement vector onto the solution space can be computed as a solution to an optimization problem as shown in this equation here. We first find the optimal theta that minimizes the L2 norm of the difference between measurement vector and measurement functions. For this, we are using nonlinear least square method. Once that optimal point is found, we can recover the PMU vector by finding the projection value onto the solution space of PMU measurements, which is h theta star. So here the solution space is the combined space of theta and y, which satisfies this equation. Let me now move on to describe the simulation setting. To determine the efficacy of our approach, we performed MATLAB simulations based on RTS96 network. We generated PMU and SCADA measurements based on, as I introduced in the model. In the RTS96 network, we deployed 21 PMUs as shown in light blue color circles in the power system diagram. And apart from these 21 PMUs, we consider that the set of PMUs coming from the red rectangle region are highly vulnerable to data attacks. So at every simulation run, we randomly attack 3 PMUs coming from this highly vulnerable range. Apart from that, as I said, we are also leveraging SCADA meters from a trustworthy set of SCADA meters. So the region A, B, and C in this diagram corresponds to the set of meters that we consider as trustworthy in different experiments. When talking about the attack, we model the attack as coming from a standard Gaussian distribution, and the standard deviation of this distribution corresponds to the severity of the attack. This figure shows the simulation results we conducted in MATLAB to recover corrupted PMU vectors using the proposed nonlinear projection method. X-axis here denotes the attack standard deviation given in degrees, and the y-axis shows the maximum absolute angle error that occurs in the estimated PMU vector. So this is like the difference, absolute and maximum angle difference between the estimated PMU vector and the true PMU vector. When we consider, if we look at this light blue color plot, that corresponds to using only PMU measurements and recovering the PMU data vector. We can see that when the attack standard deviation is around 14 degrees, the maximum angle error recorded in the measurement was roughly around 3.5 degrees, which is a significant reduction. In the second plot, if you can see the dark blue plot, that corresponds to the simulation where we used PMU measurements together with SCADA measurements coming from this region A. In that case, when the attack had a standard deviation of like 14 degrees, the maximum angle error recorded in the measurements were roughly around 1.8 degrees. So we can see as we increase the SCADA, trustworthy SCADA meters that we are using, the performance of this algorithm improved. We are actually hoping to explore more on this technique, like how the location of SCADA meters and attached PMUs affects the performance of this method. Also, we aim in developing different projection techniques rather than Euclidean projection to come up with this algorithm. And let me move back to Travis.
All right, so we have all the parts there, so where are we going from here? So we need to validate that our protection settings and devices are set up correctly so that we're actually modeling a realistic grid. And then we need to actually put it all together and see what happens when you put in bad PMU data and if that can cause big control issues or anything like that. And I'd like to open up to questions if anyone has any.
Any questions from Illinois? We probably are we unmuted? Oh, okay, good. Okay, this looks like we have questions from Illinois.
Sorry, what was that saying?
If I can. Sorry, I said it doesn't look like we have any questions from Illinois.
Okay.
I actually have one question. If you go back to one slide before, so here, Shashi, you're saying that for the first line or the second line, maybe it's just the y-axis. What's the scale of y-axis? That's what I'm confused about. Because you say that when the attack standard deviation is almost 40 degrees, right?
14 degrees.
14 degrees.
Yeah.
It's in degrees.
14, yeah.
Okay, so
it's like
the x-axis is 14 degrees then?
Or no, x or
okay, and the deviation, okay, yeah. Is 3, okay, so I heard it as 40, so I'm looking at and saying that should have been 20. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
All right. There's no other questions. We'll have Jen.
Oh, WSU has a question.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, are there any more questions for that presentation?
No, WSU has a question, Sherry. I think Anurag has a question.
Yes.
Oh.
So how do you differentiate between physical system problems and cyber attack and sensor problems?
How do you differentiate between a physical system problem versus a cyber attack? When a PMU thing is off, how do you know it's not some issue in the physical system versus it's an attack?
Well, right now, I think the RTS 96 case, we were just assuming that those were cyber attacks, that portion of those that might have been compromised.
Yeah, but I think
I think the next thing to distinguish that, Anurag, I think is what Travis is working on with those group settings, and try to see what is the actual distinction between maybe getting the log from switching the settings. So that should be put on the Python API too. So kind of a verbose of and then eliminate that scenario. And then if that didn't resolve on the API, then we need to assume there was a physical attack, I think.
Yeah, so there was one more thing we explored, Anurag, and we haven't gone too much further. I mean, I'm not involved in this specific effort, but I know Eduardo and we were thinking about when we observe an event, we want to be able to tell, first of all, we want to know there is an event. Second, we want to know whether this event is a cyber event or a physical event. And the third one, we want to know how to localize it, right? In this case, it's simulation, and I think they're just observing the technique.
We're just assuming that.
Yeah, so to see if there is a cyber attack, can we fix it? But if it is indeed part of an event, so maybe what they could do is, one, have a cyber attack and see if it's a solution or not. Second, maybe you could simulate an event, like a real power system event, and see how your system deals with it. Does it think it's an attack and tries to correct it, or can it recognize that it fits the solutions based on the rest of the measurement values? Yeah. And do you? I mean, maybe you have suggestions for us, Anurag.
Yeah, I mean, so we have been working on a similar area, and what we do is that basically a lot of data is available, right? So other than PMU, of course, SCADA, and then we can also look at cyber data, right? So that will kind of give you an insight that it's a cyber or physical, followed by another two-step process. One is data analytics-based, one is physics-based, and then finally kind of manual check to just validate that what is your plan.
Yeah. So so Anurag, if I heard you correctly, you're saying that we could use PMU data, SCADA data, and also combine the cyber, something like IS data to see if there are any indicators to say this is a cyber attack, and that can be used to deal with. Yeah, I think you're probably familiar with this, right? Saman and I had, and Kate had done some work on this, and I think after Saman and you collaborated on this one, this is very much in line with the discussions Eduardo and us had about, detecting first there is an event and then classifying the event as cyber or physical. That it's a real is based on these things, but this particular project isn't there yet. I think they're just testing the how if there is a cyber attack, if they're able to recover the values. Yeah.
And what happens to the robustness of the
area
controls? Yeah. So
So, but I think it's a very interesting point that you bring up. Like, okay, if we actually deploy this, we want to know how it will react to a real power system event, and we have to check what it does. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, I'm going to hand